The envelope sat on the kitchen table where Eleanor Voss had placed it 3 days ago, and she had not touched it since. She had walked past it every morning with her coffee growing cold in her hands, every evening with the last gray light of November pressing against the windows, and she had not touched it. Not because she was afraid of it. She was 63 years old, and she had stopped being afraid of paper a long time ago. She had not touched it because somewhere deep in the worn, quiet center of herself, she understood that the moment she opened it, something would end. Or perhaps something would begin. And she was not yet certain she had the strength to know which. The house around her, the house that had been her home for 31 years, the house where she had painted the nursery yellow even though Bernard's children from his first marriage had never once slept in it, the house where she had stood at the kitchen window watching autumn come and go and come again so many times the seasons had started to feel like the same season, just wearing different clothing, that house was no longer hers. The lawyers had been very clear about that. Victor and Diane had been even clearer. "You have 30 days, Victor had said at the reading of the will, not looking at her, speaking to the attorney as though Eleanor were a piece of furniture being assessed for removal. He had said it the way a man says something he has rehearsed, something that gives him pleasure precisely because it is technically polite. We'll be generous with the timeline. 30 days. 31 years. She had done the mathematics so many times it had worn a groove in her mind. The envelope was from a law firm she did not recognize. Whitmore and Associates, Claremont County. The postmark was 11 days old. The return address listed a town called Ashford, 60 miles north, a place Eleanor had only passed through once, perhaps twice, on her way to somewhere else. She could not imagine why anyone in Ashford would be writing to her. She could not imagine why anyone anywhere was writing to her. Bernard's death had been the kind of event that rearranges the social geography of a person's life. She was discovering, with something beyond sadness, that a great many people she had believed were her friends had in fact been Bernard's friends, and the distinction mattered enormously. She sat down at the table. She picked up the envelope. She pressed her thumb beneath the flap, and she tore it open. And then she read the words that would undo and remake everything she thought she knew about the last 11 years of her life. If you've ever believed that the worst thing that could happen to you was the last thing that would happen to you, stay with this story. Because what Eleanor found inside that envelope, and what she found inside the mansion that envelope led her to, is the kind of thing that quietly restores your faith in the idea that some people in this world see you, truly see you, long before they ever tell you so. There are stories that close doors. This is one that opens them. If you've found this channel and this is your first time here, this is what we do. We tell the stories of people who were written off, and then were not. Stories for those of us who know what it means to be overlooked, and what it means to finally be found. You won't want to miss how this one ends. Eleanor Mary Voss, born Eleanor Mary Calloway, grew up in a small mill town in western Pennsylvania where the hills were green for exactly 3 months of the year and gray for the other 9, and where people learned early that the world was not obligated to be kind to you, but that you were obligated to be kind to the world anyway. Her mother had taught her that. Her grandmother, a narrow, strong woman who wore her hair in a braid until the day she died at 87, had reinforced it. The women in Eleanor's family were not the kind who demanded. They were the kind who gave. She had been a schoolteacher, elementary school, 2nd grade, for 22 years before her knees had started to protest the long days on her feet, and she had moved into a part-time tutoring practice she ran from the dining room table. She had met Bernard Voss at a school fundraising event when she was 31 years old, a newly divorced man 10 years her senior with 2 12-year-old twins and a grief about his first marriage that he wore like an overcoat he couldn't take off. She had recognized the grief. She had been gentle with it. "You have the most patient eyes I've ever seen," Bernard had told her on their 3rd date, at a restaurant by the river. He had meant it as a compliment. He had no idea, Eleanor would reflect many years later, how accurately he had described the nature of what their relationship would require from her. They married when the twins were 15. Victor and Diane Voss were not vicious children, not precisely. They were the children of a man who had indulged their grief into entitlement, who had compensated for their disrupted childhood by removing every obstacle from their paths, every consequence from their actions. By the time Eleanor entered their lives, they had been thoroughly trained to expect accommodation. She was simply the next person in a long line of people expected to accommodate them. She tried. That is perhaps the most important and most heartbreaking thing to understand about Eleanor. She genuinely tried. She packed Victor's lunches with notes tucked inside, small jokes, small encouragements, because she knew he was struggling in mathematics and she knew better than to say so directly with a boy of 15. She drove Diane to her dance recitals without being asked, sat in the front row taking photographs on a camera she'd bought specifically for that purpose, framed the best ones and hung them in the hallway. She hosted the twins' birthdays with the kind of careful attention to detail that speaks not of obligation but of love. Diane's 17th with lavender streamers because it was her favorite color that year, Victor's with a bonfire in the backyard because he had mentioned once, offhandedly, that his mother used to make bonfires. Neither of them ever said thank you. Not once. Not in 23 years. Bernard noticed, or perhaps Bernard chose not to notice. Eleanor was never entirely certain which. He was a man of enormous warmth in the abstract and frequent blindness in the specific. He loved Eleanor in the way that some men love, as a constant, as a background condition, the way one loves clean air. He did not notice that she had stopped asking for things. He did not notice that she had stopped expressing wants because wants, in this household, produced only the mild bewilderment of a man who had not been paying enough attention to know what she had been doing all this time. And she had been doing so much. She managed the house with military precision and the appearance of effortless grace. When Bernard's business, a regional logistics company he had inherited from his own father, went through a difficult period in the mid-2000s, it was Eleanor who quietly took on additional tutoring clients, 6, 7, 8 students a week, sometimes more, and deposited the money into their joint account without ever mentioning it. When Bernard's health began to decline, the first heart episode at 62, the second at 66, the slow downstream of complications that followed, it was Eleanor who became, quietly, entirely his caregiver. She learned his medications by heart. She attended every medical appointment. She drove him to cardiac rehabilitation 3 mornings a week for 2 years and waited in the lobby with a book she rarely managed to read because she was too busy watching the door. She told herself this was love. She still believes it was. But love, she would come to understand, should not require the complete erasure of the self. And there was something else, a small, particular thread in the fabric of those years that she had never quite been able to pull without fear of what might unravel. In the spring of 2013, she had noticed the irregularity for the first time. A withdrawal from their joint savings account, substantial but not alarming, with a description she did not recognize. She had asked Bernard about it, gently, over dinner. He had given her an explanation, a business expense, a vendor payment, that was technically plausible and somehow entirely unconvincing. She had let it go. She had been letting things go for so long it had become a reflex. There had been other small moments. A name she found written on a notepad by the telephone, a woman's name, a cell phone number, which Bernard had explained away with smooth, practiced ease. A Christmas card addressed to him personally, no return address, which had disappeared from the mail pile before she could read the signature. A hotel receipt in the breast pocket of a sport coat she had sent to the dry cleaners. Another business trip, he had said. She had come to him with it in her hand and he had taken it from her the way you take a sharp object from a child. Quickly, calmly, with the silent communication that the matter was closed. She had been 61 years old when she found the receipt. 30 years of marriage. She had looked at Bernard Voss across their kitchen, and she had made the calculation that she always made, the one she was ashamed of even as she made it. The calculation that weighed what she knew against what she feared, that weighed the pain of knowing against the pain of leaving, that weighed 30 years against whatever years she might have remaining. And she had said nothing. Anne Bernard had thanked her for the dry cleaning and asked whether there was any of that chicken left from dinner. He died 14 months later. A third cardiac event, catastrophic and swift. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. She had held his hand in the hospital room anyway, the hand already cooling, and she had forgiven him everything she was not yet certain he had done. She had done it for herself, not for him. That is a distinction that matters. Then had come the will. It was read in the offices of Bernard's attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch whom Eleanor had always found slightly oily and who seemed to find the entire reading of the will an occasion for a very precise kind of neutrality, the neutrality of a man who knows which way the wind is blowing and has arranged himself accordingly. Victor and Diane arrived together, as they always did, wearing expressions of practiced gravity that did not quite mask something else. Something anticipatory. Something almost satisfied. Eleanor had dressed carefully that morning. She had worn the slate-gray dress Bernard had always liked, the one with the pearl buttons, and she had done her hair the way she had been doing it for 30 years, swept back and pinned, because she was 63 years old and she was not going to pretend to be anything other than exactly what she was. Gerald Fitch read the will in his careful, toneless voice, and as he read, Eleanor felt the cold begin somewhere in her chest and move outward, the way ice spreads from the center of a lake, slowly and then all at once. Bernard's business interests, the company, the investments, the portfolio of regional properties he had accumulated over 40 years, went, in their entirety, to Victor and Diane. This was not a surprise. Bernard had always spoken of keeping the business in the family, and Eleanor had understood, without ever being told directly, that she was not entirely what he meant by family. The house, her house, the house she had lived in for 31 years, the house she had filled with careful love and quiet labor, went to Victor and Diane as well, to be managed as an asset or sold at their discretion. To Eleanor, Bernard had left a monthly allowance of $1,400, drawn from a trust that would terminate after 10 years or upon her death, whichever came first, and the use of the house for 30 days following the reading of the will, to allow time for the orderly transition of her personal belongings. That was the language. Orderly transition. She sat very still in the leather chair and listened to Gerald Fitch read these words, and she noticed, in a distant, observational way, that her hands had found the armrests of the chair and were gripping them with a force that was entirely at odds with her stillness. She noticed that the room smelled of old paper and something citrusy, lemon furniture polish, and that there was a water stain on the ceiling tile above Gerald's desk in the shape of a spreading hand. She noticed all of these things because noticing them kept her from making a sound. Victor's exhale beside her was barely audible. It was a sound of satisfaction, contained and deliberate, the sound of a man ticking an item off a list. Diane was already looking at her phone. And then Victor turned to Eleanor, and on his face was that expression she had catalogued and dreaded for 23 years, the expression of false warmth, which is more cutting than coldness because it requires the person it is directed at to pretend to receive it. "Eleanor," he said, as though her name were a complete sentence. "This must be so hard. If there's anything we can do to make the transition easier." He paused. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The sentence was already finished by the fact of the room they were sitting in, by the document Gerald Fitch was folding and returning to its envelope, by the 30 days and the $1,400 and the word transition used as a synonym for eviction. She looked at him. She said, "Thank you, Victor." Her voice was entirely calm. Later, she would not remember driving home. She would remember sitting in the car in the driveway for 40 minutes without being able to make herself go inside, and she would remember the sound of rain beginning on the roof of the car, and she would remember thinking, with a clarity that felt almost surgical, that she had spent 31 years building a life in that house and that a life and a home are not the same thing, and that she was not certain she had understood that distinction until this moment. She went inside. She made tea. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the rain. And she did not cry, not yet, because the grief was too large and too complicated for the simple relief of tears. It was not merely the loss of the house or the money or the security. It was the confirmation of something she had been quietly refusing to know for a very long time, that Bernard, for all his warmth, for all his dependence on her, had never truly seen her as his partner. She had been a caregiver, a manager, a presence. She had not been, in the final accounting, a person whose future he had felt responsible for. She went to sleep that night in the room that had been hers for 31 years, in the bed where she had nursed Bernard through 2 flu seasons and a broken collarbone and 2 cardiac recoveries, and she lay in the dark listening to the rain on the windows, and she thought about her mother's hands, the way they had looked making bread, And she thought about the yellow nursery she had painted in year 3 of the marriage when she had still believed the twins might come to love her, and she thought about the name on the notepad by the telephone, and she understood, with a grief that was also, strangely, uncomplicatedly, a relief, that she was alone, and had perhaps been alone for a very long time, and that the aloneness was at least honest. In the morning she found the envelope from Whitmore and Associates. She had placed it on the table. She had not touched it for 3 days. And then on the 4th morning she sat down and tore it open. The letter was written in the careful, formal language of a legal communication, but even through the formality, something else was present, a quality of care, of deliberateness, as though the words had been chosen not merely to convey information but to be gentle with the person receiving it. The attorney, a woman named Catherine Whitmore, informed Eleanor that the late Corinne Ashwood of Ashford, Massachusetts, had passed away 6 weeks prior at the age of 81. Ms. Ashwood had named Eleanor Mary Voss, née Calloway, as the sole beneficiary and heir of her estate, which comprised, in its entirety, Ashgrove Manor and its surrounding 11 acres of land, the contents thereof, and a holding account the precise balance of which would be disclosed upon Eleanor's arrival for the formal transfer of title. Eleanor read this letter 4 times. Then she set it down and looked out the kitchen window for a very long time. Corinne Ashwood. She had to reach back through the years, back through the gray weight of the last months, back through the long tunnel of Bernard's illness and Bernard's death and Bernard's will. She found the memory like a smooth stone at the bottom of a river, small, unremarkable looking, but present. 11 years ago. No, 12. It had been the autumn of 2013, the same autumn of the bank withdrawal she hadn't understood, the same autumn she had been running on fumes and careful silence and the performance of a contentment she no longer felt. She had gone, one Saturday morning in October, to the farmer's market in a neighboring town, 40 minutes north of home, because she had needed to be somewhere different. She had needed the small mercy of unfamiliar streets. She had been standing at a stall selling late-season apples when she had noticed the woman, very old, or no, not old exactly, but ancient in the way that certain people are ancient, as though they have accumulated more than their body can comfortably hold. The woman was standing at the edge of the market, slightly apart from everything, watching the crowd with an expression of distant, amused observation. She was wearing a dark coat that was too thin for the October morning, and she had the look of someone who had arrived somewhere without quite having planned to get there. Eleanor had walked over. That was the whole of it, really, that simple, unpremeditated act of walking toward someone who appeared to be cold and alone. She had offered to get the woman a cup of coffee from the vendor across the aisle. The woman, who introduced herself only as Corinne, had accepted with a formality that suggested she was not accustomed to such gestures. They had sat together at one of the small tables set up near the market entrance. They had talked for perhaps an hour. Corinne was sharp, wry, entirely alert, and she had a way of listening that Eleanor had found unexpectedly moving, the way a person listens when they are genuinely interested, when they are taking what you say seriously, when they are not simultaneously composing their response or checking the time. Eleanor could not remember the last time anyone had listened to her like that. She had not told Corinne very much. Only small things. That she was tired, that the autumn was particularly beautiful this year, that she had been teaching a boy to read who had never believed he could, and that the moment he had read his first full sentence aloud, his face had done something that had made her want to sit down and cry in the best possible way. She had not told Corinne about the bank withdrawal or the name on the notepad. She had not told her about Bernard. Corinne had told her, in return, that she lived in a big house that most people found frightening, and that she found this tremendously funny. She had said this with a smile that was at once entirely private and somehow inclusive, as though she were letting Eleanor in on a joke she had been keeping to herself for years. She had told her that the house had belonged to her family for 4 generations and that she was the last of them, and that she had not yet decided what would become of it. They had parted ways at noon, when the market was beginning to close. Corinne had shaken Eleanor's hand with both of hers, firm and dry and warm, and looked at her for a long moment with those remarkable gray eyes, and she had said, "You are a good person, Eleanor. I mean that as a precise description, not a pleasantry. The world has a great many kind people and a much smaller number of good ones." Eleanor had driven home holding those words in her chest like a candle she was afraid to jostle. She had not expected to see Corinne again. She had not seen Corinne again, not face to face. But over the following months, then years, small things had arrived at her door. A handwritten note at Christmas, short, always sharp and warm in equal measure. A book, once. A novel about a woman who builds a lighthouse with her own hands, tucked inside a padded envelope with a note that read only, "I thought you should have this." A postcard from Scotland, though Eleanor had no idea when or whether Corinne had been to Scotland. The correspondence was spare and irregular, and yet each piece of it had the quality of a hand placed briefly on a shoulder, small, unmistakable, sustaining. Eleanor had written back. She had been careful in her responses, not quite knowing what she could say without saying too much. She had told Corinne about her tutoring students, about the town, about the particular way the light looked on the river in March. She had not told her about the hotel receipt in the breast pocket of Bernard's sport coat. But she thought sometimes that Corinne, in her spare and precise way, understood anyway. And then, 14 months ago, the correspondence had simply stopped. Eleanor had assumed, with a sadness that surprised her in its depth, that Corinne had died. She had not known how to find out. She had not known her last name until this moment. Ashgrove Manor. She found it on her phone in under a minute. The photograph that came up, taken by someone from the road, on what appeared to be an overcast spring morning, showed an enormous Victorian structure set back from an iron gate, surrounded by overgrown elms and an unkempt stone wall, its upper stories half obscured by mist. It looked exactly like the kind of house that local legend would surround with stories. It looked, Eleanor thought, like somewhere Corinne would live with great satisfaction and absolutely no apology. The next morning she called Catherine Whitmore. She drove to Ashford on a Wednesday in November, when the trees were bare and the sky was the color of old pewter and the highway north was nearly empty. She had packed a single bag, because she did not know how long she would need to stay or what staying would mean, and because she was at a point in her life where the act of packing light felt less like a practical decision and more like a philosophical one. She was not taking more than she could carry. Not anymore. The landscape outside her window changed as she drove north. The dense suburban snarl of the highway gave way to smaller towns, quieter roads, fields of standing corn reduced to their stalks, old farmhouses with smoke rising from their chimneys. There was something about the emptiness of the November landscape that she found, today, not desolate but spacious. As though the world had set down its unnecessary things and was breathing. She passed a handwritten sign nailed to a fence post, Ashford, 12 miles, and felt something stir in her that she could not immediately name. Not excitement precisely. Something more cautious than that. Something like the sensation of a window opening in a room that has been closed for a long time. She met Catherine Whitmore at the attorney's office on Ashford's narrow main street, a composed, sharp-featured woman in her late 40s with reading glasses pushed up into dark hair and the manner of someone who believed in being direct because she respected the people she was being direct with. They shook hands. Catherine offered coffee, which Eleanor accepted gratefully. They sat. "Before we proceed to the property," Catherine said, "I want to give you some context." Corinne was very specific about how she wanted this handled. She anticipated that you might have questions. She prepared, comprehensively I would say, for that. She paused. She also anticipated that other parties might contest the will. She prepared for that as well. Eleanor looked at her. "Which other parties?" Catherine gave a small, dry smile. "I'll let the documentation speak to that. But I will say, Corinne Ashwood did not do things by half measures. In 30 years of estate law, I have never prepared a will quite as airtight, quite as deliberately engineered, as the one she asked me to draw up 18 months ago." She picked up a folder. "Shall we go to the house?" They drove in separate cars down a narrow road that wound away from the town center through a mile of old-growth elm, the bare branches arching overhead to form a corridor of interlaced gray against the pale sky. And then the iron gate appeared, open, Catherine had called ahead, and the drive curved through the overgrown grounds, past stone walls wearing their moss like a garment, past the remains of what had once been a formal garden, past a stone fountain dry and still and gathering leaves. And then the house itself came into view, and Eleanor stopped breathing for a moment. It was enormous. It was dark with age and weather and the particular dignity of things that have stood in one place long enough to become part of the landscape rather than an imposition upon it. The front facade of gray stone had 3 stories of tall narrow windows, many of them intact, some shuttered, and above the entrance a stone arch carved with a design she couldn't make out from the car, something botanical, intertwined vines or branches. The grounds, though overgrown, had the bones of something that had once been deliberately beautiful. You could see it if you looked, the shape of old planting beds, the line of what might have been a formal walk, the suggestion of order beneath the wildness. The key that Catherine handed her was large and iron, warm from Catherine's coat pocket, and heavier than Eleanor expected. She put it in the lock. She turned it. The door opened. The smell was the first thing. Old wood, stone, cold air, and something else beneath it, something faint and particular that she could not immediately identify, something almost floral, as though someone had kept dried lavender here once and the ghost of it remained. The entrance hall was tall, 2 stories at least, with a curved staircase rising to the upper floors, its banister dark with age. The floors were stone, and her footsteps rang in the silence with a clarity that felt almost ceremonial. Someone had recently cleaned. Not deeply, not exhaustively, but carefully. The windows on the ground floor had been washed, so that the pale November light came in without obstruction, and the worst of the dust had been addressed. There were flowers on the hall table. Fresh ones, white chrysanthemums in a simple glass vase, with a small card tucked against the stems. Eleanor picked up the card. It read, in a handwriting she recognized immediately as Corinne's, angular, precise, unmistakable, "Welcome home, Eleanor. The key on the mantelpiece in the study is for the cedar chest. Begin there." Her breath caught. She looked at Catherine, who was standing slightly behind her with the patient expression of someone who has watched this moment and considered carefully how much space to give it. "She wrote the note 3 weeks before she passed," Catherine said quietly. "She arranged for the flowers this morning through the florist in town. She paid for them in advance. She was very specific about the variety." Eleanor held the card for a long moment. Then she walked toward the study. The study was at the back of the house, off the main hall, a room of dark bookshelves and a fireplace and a large oak desk, and on the mantelpiece above the empty hearth, a small brass key on a silk ribbon. The cedar chest sat in the corner beneath a window, low and wide and smelling of its wood even from across the room. Eleanor's hands were entirely steady as she crossed to it, picked up the key, and fit it to the lock. Inside the chest, carefully arranged, was a life's worth of documentation. There were folders, labeled in Corinne's handwriting, financial accounts, property deeds, the will and its attachments, a sealed envelope marked simply for Eleanor, and below all of it, a large leather-bound portfolio tied with a black ribbon. She opened the letter first. The paper was cream-colored and heavy, the kind you have to seek out in specialty shops. It was written by hand, in Corinne's angular script, and it was 4 pages long. Eleanor read it once, standing at the cedar chest. Then she sat down on the floor because there was no chair near enough and her legs had stopped cooperating, and she read it again from the beginning. Corinne had written, "My dear Eleanor, if you are reading this, then you have found your way to Ashgrove, which means 2 things. I am gone, and you needed a door. I am glad this one was here for you. I will not be sentimental at length, because you already know how I feel, and because sentiment without substance is merely decoration. But I will say this once, plainly, so that it is said and cannot be unsaid. You were the most genuinely good person I met in my last decade on this earth, and I have met a great many people. What made you good was not your patience, though your patience was remarkable. What made you good was that you never performed goodness. You simply were it even when it cost you, even when no one saw. I saw. I want to explain some things because you deserve explanations. I want to begin with the ones that may be difficult to receive. Approximately 18 months before Bernard Voss's death, this would have been March of 2022, I was contacted by an attorney who had been engaged by a woman named Sandra Elliott, formerly of Charleston, South Carolina, who had what she described as a long-standing and significant financial arrangement with your husband. I will not use language that wounds unnecessarily, But I want you to know that the situation was substantive and sustained, and that it involved a considerable amount of money from accounts that were, in some part, built from your contributions. I was contacted because this woman's attorney had made discreet inquiries about you in the course of preparing for a potential legal action, and those inquiries had, through a series of connections that I imagine would surprise you, found their way to me. I chose not to tell you at the time. I examined that choice carefully, as I examine all my choices, and I concluded that telling you would cause harm that I was not in a position to remedy. You were managing a very ill husband. You had constructed a life inside a structure that, however imperfect, was the structure you had chosen, and I did not believe it was my right to dismantle it from the outside. What I could do, and what I chose to do, was something else entirely. I had my attorneys conduct a thorough and entirely legal examination of Bernard Voss's financial affairs. What they found, I will summarize. The accounts that should have been held jointly between you and your husband had been, over a period of approximately 9 years, subject to a pattern of withdrawals that had moved approximately $340,000 into accounts that did not include you as a beneficiary. In the legal opinion of my counsel, a significant portion of this constituted marital assets to which you had a claim. This information was collected, documented, and prepared for precisely the scenario that has now come to pass, that Bernard's will would not honor what was rightfully yours, and that his children, whose characters I had also made it my business to understand, would not choose, of their own generosity, to remedy the injustice. The portfolio at the bottom of the chest contains the full documentation. It is organized and annotated by Catherine Whitmore, who will guide you through it at whatever pace you need. I want you to understand what it means. It means that should Victor and Diane Voss choose to contest your inheritance of Ashgrove Manor, which Catherine and I expect they will, because people of their particular type always reach for more, they will find themselves in the position of opening a legal process that will, as a consequence of their action, compel full disclosure of the financial irregularities in their father's estate. The attorneys I have retained on your behalf, paid in full by my own estate, are very good at what they do, and they are already prepared. In plain terms, if they pull the thread, the entire fabric unravels for them. Not for you. You may be wondering what I get out of this. I get nothing, of course, in the material sense. I am dead, Eleanor. What I get, or rather what I already received, was the 11 years of correspondence with a woman whose letters made the last chapter of my life considerably less lonely than it might have been. A woman who once sat down across from a cold old stranger at a farmer's market because the stranger looked like she needed a cup of coffee. That is not a small thing. In my experience, it is the opposite of a small thing. Ashgrove Manor needs someone who will love it. It needs someone who sees what a house can hold. Not as a possession, but as a vessel for living. I believe you are that person. What you do with it is entirely yours to decide. The account that will be disclosed to you this week contains enough to restore it, to run it, to begin whatever you choose to begin. I only ask one thing: do not be small with it. The house is large. Be as large as it is. I have loved you in the way that old women love the young women they wish they had known earlier, with the particular tenderness of recognition and the particular frustration of not being able to give you all of the time we didn't have. You deserved more of it. But you have the house. And the house has time to spare. With everything I have, which is, apparently, quite a lot, Corinne Ashwood. Eleanor sat on the floor of the study of Ashgrove Manor for a very long time. The November light moved across the floor in a slow diagonal, the way light does in large, quiet rooms where it has space to do as it pleases. At some point, she became aware that she was laughing. Not the laughter of hilarity, but the laughter of a person who has been handed something so precisely right, so exactly fitted to the shape of the wound, that the body simply does not know what else to do. It was laughter that was also weeping, and weeping that was also relief, and relief that was also rage at everything she had endured and hadn't needed to endure, and rage that was also, slowly, becoming something she recognized as gratitude, not the obligated kind, not the performed kind, but the real and ungovernable kind that rises up from somewhere below the ribs and fills the chest until there is no room for anything else. Catherine Whitmore appeared quietly in the doorway at some point during this. She did not speak. She sat down in the chair by the desk and she set a box of tissues on the floor near Eleanor and she waited, because she had been in the practice of estate law for 30 years and she understood that some inheritances require time to receive. When Eleanor could speak, she looked up at Catherine with eyes that were wet but entirely clear. "The account," she said. "How much?" Catherine told her. Eleanor nodded once, slowly, the way you nod when a number confirms something you didn't know you were expecting. "And the documentation about Bernard's accounts?" "Complete. Annotated. Ready." "And if Victor and Diane contest the will?" Catherine's expression did something precise. "Then they will have initiated a legal process that requires disclosure of all assets in the marital estate at the time of Bernard's death, including the accounts that were moved, including the arrangements made with persons outside the marriage, including the tax irregularities, which are, I should note, considerable, and which the IRS has not yet been made aware of, a situation that our attorneys have been carefully maintaining." She paused. "It's your choice whether to tell them this before they contest, or to allow them to discover it after. Both have their merits." Eleanor stood up from the floor. She smoothed her skirt. She looked around the study, the bookshelves, the fireplace, the tall window through which the overgrown garden was visible, everything dormant and waiting under the gray November sky. "I'd like to call Victor," she said. She called him from the study of Ashgrove Manor, standing at the window with the phone held to her ear and Corinne's letter folded in her hand. Victor answered on the third ring with the particular tone of a man answering a call he considers a minor nuisance. "Eleanor." The same way he had said it at the lawyer's office. A name as a sentence. "Victor," she said. "I'm calling because I want to give you information you need before you do something you can't undo." The pause. "What information?" "I've been named the sole heir of an estate in Ashford. You'll have received the legal notification by now, or it will arrive tomorrow. I expect that you and Diane are already considering a challenge." Another pause, fractionally longer. She could hear the shift in his attention, the calculation beginning. "We have questions about the validity of—" "Before you take any legal steps," Eleanor said, and her voice was entirely even, entirely unhurried, the voice of a woman who has been waiting for this conversation for a very long time without knowing she was waiting for it. "I need you to speak to your own attorney. Not to contest anything. To ask them to review the full financial disclosure of your father's estate." She paused. "All of it. Including the accounts that weren't in the will." Silence. "I'm not threatening you, Victor. I want to be precise about that. I am giving you information. What you do with it is your decision. But I would encourage you to make it carefully." She let the pause breathe between them. "I've found my footing. I hope you and Diane have yours." She ended the call. She stood at the window for a moment. In the garden below, a single crow had landed on the rim of the stone fountain and was regarding the empty basin with what appeared to be philosophical resignation. She watched it for a moment. Then something unexpected moved through her, quiet, warm, almost gentle. She recognized it after a moment. It was peace. She had not spoken in anger. She had not needed to. The truth had done the speaking, and the truth, it turned out, was louder than anything she might have said in rage. Victor called back 12 minutes later. His voice had a different quality, not soft. Victor Voss did not have the register for softness, but careful. Recalibrated. "We'll need some time to review things," he said. "Of course," said Eleanor. "We may have been hasty in our initial approach to the estate." "I understand," said Eleanor. And she did understand, in the way one understands the mechanics of something one is no longer subject to. "The house," he said, and then stopped. 30 days was your offer," Eleanor said pleasantly. "I'll collect my remaining belongings in 2. I don't need more than that." She heard him exhale. She heard, in the exhale, the precise sound of a man who has discovered that the door he intended to close had been a wall all along, and that the woman he thought he was blocking had already walked through a different one. Diane never called. This was, Eleanor reflected, entirely consistent with everything she knew about Diane. She drove back to the house she had lived in for 31 years on a Thursday morning in early December, and she collected what was hers in exactly 2 days. It was less than she expected and more than she needed. She took the photographs from the hallway, the ones she had taken at Diane's recitals, because she had taken them and they were therefore hers. She took the books she had read and the ones she had not yet read. She took her grandmother's china and her mother's cast-iron skillet. She took the small wooden box of correspondence that included Corinne's letters, every one of them, tied with kitchen twine. She took nothing that was Bernard's and nothing that was the house's. She took only herself, which was, it turned out, sufficient. The man from the moving company who helped her carry boxes to the rented van was young, 22 perhaps, with the easy kindness of someone who has been well loved, and when he noticed her pausing in the entryway on the final trip, standing there with her hand on the doorframe in the way you stand when you are saying goodbye to something complex, he said nothing, only waited, and when she was ready she nodded and he carried the last box out and held the van door and said, "You good?" with such uncomplicated genuine concern that she had to laugh. "Yes," she said. "I think I actually am." The restoration of Ashgrove Manor did not happen overnight. Nothing worth having happens overnight. It happened the way things happen when a person has both resources and intention and, crucially, time. The real kind of time, the unscheduled kind, the kind that opens up when you stop managing someone else's life and begin attending to your own. Eleanor moved into the East Wing in December, into 2 rooms that needed only cleaning and new beds and the kind of warmth that comes from fires in the fireplace and good lamps. She lived in those rooms through the winter and learned the house the way you learn a person. Gradually, with patience, with attention to what it was telling her rather than what she expected it to be. She learned where the drafts came from and which windows caught the afternoon sun and which floorboards spoke and what the silence in the upper hallway sounded like at 3 in the morning, which was a different quality of silence from anything she had known in the house in which she had spent 31 years. She hired a young architect from Ashford named Petra Vance who had grown up in the town and who, it turned out, had been fascinated by Ashgrove Manor since childhood, riding her bicycle past its iron gate the way children ride their bicycles past the places that frighten and compel them in equal measure. Petra wept, briefly and unapologetically, the first time Eleanor let her walk through all 11 rooms on the ground floor. "I never thought anyone would do this," Petra said, pressing both hands to her face. "I always thought it would just fall." "It didn't fall," said Eleanor. By March, the structural work had begun. By April, the garden had yielded, reluctantly and then with increasing grace, to the hands of a local man named Thomas Farrow who had been a landscape architect for 40 years and who had come out of semi-retirement specifically because Eleanor had described the bones of the garden to him over the telephone and he had said, with the conviction of a man who has found a missing thing, "I know exactly what that was. I can tell you exactly what it was." The community arrived the way communities arrive. Slowly and then all at once. The florist who had sent the chrysanthemums on Corinne's instruction turned out to be a woman named B who had known Corinne for 30 years and who showed up one Saturday with a van full of bulbs for the garden and no explanation except that Corinne had asked her to. The librarian at the Ashford Public Library, a retired schoolteacher named James, who had heard that the new owner of Ashgrove was also a retired schoolteacher, appeared one afternoon with a box of materials he had been keeping back from DX session for 20 years because he felt they deserved better than the discard pile. They sat together in the study, James and Eleanor, going through the box, and they talked about teaching and about reading and about the moment a child understands that stories belong to them, and by the time Eleanor looked up it was dark outside and she had not noticed. By May, she had decided what she wanted to do with the West Wing. She called it the Corinne Ashwood Reading Room, because Corinne would have objected strenuously to any more formal honoring and because the name was accurate. It was a space, 2 large rooms opening onto each other and onto the garden, designed for children from the county's underserved rural areas to come and read and be read to and be tutored and be told, in whatever way the room and the people in it could tell them, that they were precisely worth this much investment. A room with good light and good books and the smell of cedar and old stone and fresh lavender growing in pots on the windowsill. A room that said, "Someone thought of you before you arrived. Someone prepared this for you." They opened in June, on a Saturday afternoon when the garden was finally, actually, undeniably beautiful, when Thomas Farrow's roses were blooming along the low stone wall and the fountain had been repaired and was running and the children who came from 3 towns over ran straight for it, naturally, immediately, the way children run toward water. Eleanor stood at the edge of the garden watching them, a cup of coffee cooling in her hand, and Bea came to stand beside her, and for a while neither of them said anything. Corinne would be insufferable about this, Bea said finally. She'd pretend she wasn't pleased and she'd be absolutely incandescent with pleasure. Eleanor smiled. I know, she said. She was 63 years old, and she was standing in a garden she had not known existed 8 months ago, watching children discover water, and the grief of the previous year was not gone. She did not believe it would be entirely gone, because loss of the kind she had carried does not entirely leave, it simply becomes one of many things the body knows, but it had been joined by something else. Something that did not erase it but sat beside it, the way music sits beside silence and each makes the other more itself. She had spent 31 years managing someone else's life with such thoroughness and such invisibility that she had, for long stretches, almost ceased to exist as a person with her own needs, her own desires, her own vision of what a life could hold. She had given, and the giving had been real. She did not regret the giving because the giving had been hers, it had been the expression of who she was, and she would not disown it. But she understood now, in the bone-deep way that only experience teaches, that giving from a full and tended self is not the same as giving from a diminished and depleted one. The first is abundance. The second is disappearance. Corinne had seen her. A woman she had met once, briefly, over a cup of coffee at a farmer's market on a cold October morning, had spent 11 years quietly watching and understanding, and had arranged, with considerable legal precision and what must have been tremendous foresight, to make certain that Eleanor would not be left behind. The worst thing that had happened to her, the will, the 30 days, the $1,400 and the word transition used as a synonym for erasure, had turned out to be the mechanism by which she found the door. She would not say she was grateful for the wound. She would say that the wound had been precisely the shape of the door. She had thought, sitting in Gerald Fitch's office with her hands gripping the armrests and the smell of lemon polish in her nose and the spreading hand of the water stain on the ceiling above her, that something was ending. She had been right. Something was ending. But it was not the thing she had feared. It was the thing that had needed to end, the long, careful, loving performance of a woman whose life was organized entirely around the needs and recognition of others, who had been patient so long she had forgotten patience was meant to be a means and not a destination. She looked at the children by the fountain. She looked at the roses. She looked at the house rising above the garden, its gray stone warm now in the June afternoon, its windows full of light. What she had thought was a closing had been, all along, an opening. She had just needed to walk through it. If this story touched something in you, I want to ask you something, and I mean it as a genuine question, not a prompt. Leave one word in the comments below. One word that describes the moment you realized your own strength. It doesn't have to be a triumphant word. It can be a quiet word, a tired word, a word that only you fully understand. This community has been built on exactly those words, and every one of them matters. And if you know someone, a mother, a sister, a friend, a woman who has been giving for so long she has forgotten that she is also allowed to receive, share this with her. Not as a message, as a hand on a shoulder. Because sometimes the stories that find us are the ones we most needed someone to send. We'll be here, telling the stories of the people who were almost forgotten and were not. The ones who were quiet and then, finally, were heard. If that's the kind of story you need in your life, and I believe if you've stayed with Eleanor this far, that it is, then you already know where to find us. Some endings are not endings at all. They are the last door you have to open before the house reveals itself. Eleanor opened hers.